Good morning. I am not Rob Perkins. We are starting a brand new quarter today. Our quarter system, September, October, November, December through May. We're going to have 2 quarters looking at volume 2 of our workbook, Amazed by Jesus. And that's what we're going to be coming back to. It was a year ago that we started, and we're going to continue to go through that. Volume 1 looks like this. And I know many of you acquired a copy. And volume 2, I have copies of it available. The church is not paying for them. I have purchased them if you want to buy one from me for $20. I hate making merchandise in the house of the Lord. But you can see on the screen that we studied volume 1 over a period of 6 months, December through May, and we're going to do the same with volume 2. And as exciting and as important as volume 1 was, let me tell you, volume 2 has Jesus' death on the cross, and has all the post-resurrection appearances, and we actually won't get to that until March. Instead of just looking at the Gospels generally, we're looking at them together, looking at all 4 Gospels together. And this is an extremely important way to see these 4 books, which make up so much of our New Testament, content-wise. This is going to be our textbook for the next 6 months. If you want to get a copy of it, like I said, I've got them here. I have a worksheet that I will provide every week. If it's out in the foyer right now, that at least lets you know what page numbers we're going to be looking at from the book, and have some questions that will help us in our prep work, in our prep study. So I've got today's out there and next week's as well. And I'll keep up with that, I promise. Don't record that part. I don't want anybody to go back to it. So, looking at the 4 Gospels, why do we have 4 Gospels? And why would you even want to combine the 4 Gospels? Let's think about that for a moment. We're not looking at Matthew. We're not looking at just Mark or Luke. We're looking at all 4 together. How do they together present the ministry of Jesus? Why do you want to combine all 4 of them? Did Matthew write his gospel so that we would run over to Mark and say, oh, well, let's look at Mark's account. Let's look at something here. Matthew wrote Matthew so that we would read it in its entirety. Same thing with Mark. Luke wrote Luke so that we would read it all by itself. Why is it beneficial, though, to look at all 4 together? But doesn't that get confusing? 4 different viewpoints? Okay. And so having a study of all 4 Gospels. So what the question you're answering is, why 4 Gospels? Why would you want to combine the 4 Gospels? Okay, so there's some events recorded in one Gospel that maybe another one doesn't. There are details that are mentioned where they record the same incidents, and there are different details, and that's helpful. Shane. The timeline? Okay, we're going to talk about that. Okay, so what Shane just pointed out is there are parts of Jesus' ministry that Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't record, that only John records, and vice versa as well. And so you were really answering, Antia, this question: why are there 4 Gospels? And what you said is there's 4 different perspectives, 4 dimensions, as it were. And I think we can appreciate that readily. Wait a minute, though. I thought we only had 1 Gospel. So here we are saying the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke. There's only 1 Gospel. Paul said, I am not ashamed of the Gospels. No, it is the power of God. Okay, Gospel according to Matthew. And that's exactly what you see in most of our print Bibles. What I found out when I discussed this last time is somebody said, well, I don't have that. But in my Bible, it says the gospel, singular, according to Matthew, according to Mark. There is no title in a Greek manuscript, an ancient Greek manuscript of these gospels. They're actually anonymous. We don't know. Now, people during that time period, in the late first century, the second century, they knew who these men were. It's quite apparent as we dig and see that Luke is the author of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. We have no reason to doubt the names that are provided are correct. I'm not trying to dissuade us of that at all. However, these technically did not have any names associated with them. And the titles that have been given to them are the Gospel according to Matthew, according to Mark. So there's one gospel.
Adds credibility for gospel saying different audience, so that others.
Okay, so different audiences, different details provided for various reasons. And we discussed that a year ago a little bit. We're not going to rehash that. This is really just a review today. But that's very, very good. So what you're reminding us is that these Gospels are from different authors for different audiences. And that is extremely helpful. What else did you say just now? Okay, I can't remember either. Credibility, that's what it was. It gives credibility. Let me tell you, when we look at the four Gospels dealing with the resurrection of Jesus, it is a mess. And I think that lends credibility to the resurrection. Yes, these men are inspired, but Matthew didn't say, hey, Mark, what are you going to write? Hey, Luke, let's get our story straight. It is messy, is what I probably should say instead. And when we get to that, it'll get a little confusing because you've got Jesus appearing here. You've got him seemingly not appearing to somebody else here, but this gospel says he is. This wasn't an organized effort to sit down and say, all right, let's write this down and get our story straight. It is a first-person eyewitness account. Luke, however, wasn't an eyewitness, but these other men were there. They saw the resurrected Jesus, and they talk about that a lot. All right, so we've got four inspired accounts. And by the way, and Volume 1 discusses this briefly, these are the only four accounts of Jesus' life from the first century that were recognized by people who knew the apostles, or knew people who knew the apostles as you go into the second and third centuries. They very quickly latched on to these four books. I'm sure you've heard of other gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, some writings, even a Gospel of Judas. They are spurious, they are very different, and they are not considered to be credible by scholarship, and for good reason. They are so different from what we're reading here. What does the word gospel mean? I think we know the answer to this. It means good news, glad tidings. And this word gospel was common in the first century world. It was actually, one way to look at it is this term was used, hijacked, that's too pejorative, but this is a word that was used in the Roman Empire. The word gospel was used to describe the beginning of the reign of the first Roman emperor, celebrating his rule, celebrating his birthday as a god. And this term gospel is used right at the beginning of the four gospels. Mark specifically, this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. That's Matthew 1 verse 1. So if you're looking at the four gospels together, and that's what we're going to be doing, as tempting it may be to say, I'm going to look at just John's gospel. We may do that a little bit, but we're really focused on all four, the presentation that all four give. If many events overlap, how do you find the same account of, say, the the denial, Peter's threefold denial of Jesus. So if we're going to study, when we get to this in a few months, when we get to Peter's denial of Jesus, we're going to need to turn to Matthew 26 and Mark 14 and Luke 22 and John 18. Anybody here remember all those citations? We remember the incident where Peter denied Jesus 3 times. But it's kind of hard to find them, pinpoint them real easily, because all 4 Gospels record this same event. By the way, most events are not recorded in all 4 Gospels. Many of them will be recorded in 3 out of the 4, sometimes just 2 or even 1. What is helpful, and we talked about this a year ago as well, is to use a harmony of the Gospels. And what this does is lay out the 4 different accounts side by side by side by side. And that is a very helpful guide. And then these harmonies will typically have some notes to help us as we study. What Amazed by Jesus is, it's built on the shoulders of a gospel harmony. This section number, can you see that up there? There's a little number there. This, instead of saying Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, John 18, instead say section 156. Is that what that is up there? 156. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. This is a tool. It's a tool to help us study all 4 Gospels together. And A.T. Robertson was the author of a definitive harmony of the Gospels, where he's taking the Gospels, arranging them chronologically. And he was a professor at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, taught thousands of students for years and years, and wrote a harmony. And this is what he says: a gospel harmony, this book that lays out all 4 Gospels side by side, cannot give all the aid that one needs, but it is one essential book for the serious study of the life of Jesus. A gospel harmony is extremely helpful when you're trying to look at the 4-fold gospel, all 4 Gospels together. All right, if many events overlap, how do you find accounts of the same event? What's the answer? You use a gospel harmony. All right, that's not what Amazed by Jesus is. Amazed by Jesus is a gospel survey. It is built on the shoulders of a gospel harmony. So what is an additional resource we can use to look at all 4 Gospels together? And the answer is a gospel survey that is going to take what a gospel harmony has arranged and put it all, look at it chronologically as we go through it. And that's what this book does. It was too big, so we had to make it 2 volumes. And that's what we're looking at. In volume 1, on pages 32 and 33, there is this chart that serves as the backbone for the study. It was so important that the publisher had it printed in the back flap of volume 1 and volume 2. So it only appears in volume 2 as a back flap. So here's volume 2, and it opens up nice and big here. This one, well, looks like it's torn. I was going to say, somebody want it, but looks like that page is torn. This one's not. Somebody want it? Somebody want it? You want it? You look like you want one. Let me give you. Oh, come on. We're not making merchandise right now. Here you go. And so I know the map, the chart that I printed on your sheet here is not really easy to read. This one's a lot bigger, a lot cleaner to look at. Before we go further looking at this chart, I'm gonna zoom in so we can see it a little better in the auditorium this morning. I just want to answer the questions. Then we'll walk through it, because I know this is in part for many of us a review, but for others of us, we haven't seen this in a while, and I think you're going to readily remember some of these answers. How long was Jesus' total ministry? No gospel says, and Jesus' ministry was 3.5 years. But that's about how long his ministry was, give or take. We think it's important to know that this event happened on January 12th, 27, but that wasn't on the radar of first century authors. Pinpointing dates was not always as important to them as it is to us. Chronology isn't always as important to them as it is to us. So 3.5 years is about how long Jesus' total ministry is as we look at all 4 Gospels together, piece them together, and we'll talk about how we have a good idea of why that is. Question number 2 on the back. Explain why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to as the synoptic Gospels and why John isn't included. I don't give an explanation in the questions here because we discussed that last year in volume 1. Synoptic Gospels. Which of the Gospels are the synoptic Gospels? Of the 4, only 3 are the synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Why? Seen together. Seen with the eye. That's what it literally means, to see with the eye. Synoptic. You can hear the word optic in there. Synoptic Gospels. That's how Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to because John is so different. He beats, what's the expression? He marches to the beat of his own drum, the John drum. It's just different. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke all talk about the Galilean ministry. 3 Gospels in particular. John hardly touches it. And that is a good term to understand and to appreciate because you're going to see it in your gospel studies. This term synoptic gospel. Question 3 there. Which gospel account hardly discusses any events during the nearly 2-year-long Galilean ministry? Get it into parts. And what we have is the Galilean ministry taking a big chunk of it. In fact, that's what you see right there in the red on the screen. The light red, light red again. I know it's hard to read there. Let me highlight that. This is the Galilean ministry. Early Galilean, middle Galilean, later Galilean. The great Galilean ministry of Jesus. John hardly talks about it at all. Any events from it. Question 4. Why is it important to note for our survey of the 4 Gospels that John's Gospel records 4 Passovers? Say that again. Marking of time. How do we have some idea that Jesus' ministry lasted 3.5 years? Because John records 4 Passovers. That's going to help us tremendously as we try to piece together chronologically all the events. Tell me this, what was the purpose of John the Baptist's ministry? You can see in the green up here, kind of the dark area here, you've got the ministry of John, and then John's ministry continues until he is arrested. And so the focus is on Jesus from opening events all the way to his resurrection. But John's ministry is extremely important. What did John do in relation to Jesus? What was his purpose? To prepare the way of the Lord, quoting from Isaiah 40. He's the voice in the wilderness. And that's what kings had. They had messengers who would prepare the way. Jesus is the king. John is the one telling everybody, hey, the Messiah is coming. How long had it been since there had been an authoritative prophetic voice? Yet all those prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, you had Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah. How long had it been since the last Old Testament prophet, Malachi, had been on the scene? And then John. Over 400 years. And what do we call the time period between the Old Testament and the New Testament? What do we call that? The years of silence. Sometimes it's called the intertestamental period. Don't try saying that, okay? You're not gonna make it. Yeah, I'm a professional. The intertestamental period, the silent years, but it's anything but silent. A lot happened during the silent years. And interestingly, at least I hope it will be, on Sunday nights, we're going to be studying Daniel. And Daniel writes about 600 years before, not 600 years, about 600 BC. He writes about 300 years before Alexander the Great. And he's going to be talking about that intertestamental period. So tuck that away as we get into our study of Daniel. John the Baptist was extremely important for Jesus' ministry. And John will be mentioned throughout the Gospels. We've already seen him mentioned several times in our first 6 months, and we're going to see him mentioned more, even though he's dead. All right, number 6, what 2 events, I emphasized this for the 6 months that we were together last time. What 2 events occurred back to back early in the opening events of Jesus' ministry? What were the 2 events that happened right before Jesus came to Galilee and started preaching, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand? There were 2 events, and they're together right here on the chart. Opening events. The first one is John baptized Jesus, and then immediately Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, and Jesus is tempted, tested by the devil. Luke's account says Satan. So we know who this is. Those are important. Jesus' baptism is when the Holy Spirit came on him and remained on him, John's account tells us. And that's when Jesus began his ministry in earnest. And then this confrontation right at the start between Jesus and the devil. At the end of that confrontation, the 3 temptations, does the devil say, I didn't get him to sin, I'll just leave him alone now. All throughout his 3.5-year ministry, I'll just leave him alone. Well, no. The devil left him for a season, one of the accounts tells us. And the last, what event triggered Jesus' early Galilee ministry? Let me just give you the answer. The beheading of John the Baptist. I'm sorry, the arrest. Let me double check that. The arrest. Yeah, see, there it is, the ministry of John, and then the opening events correspond with the ministry of John. Excuse me. So the answer to number 7 is what event triggered Jesus' Galilee ministry? When did he start it? Oops, I was wrong. I was right, and I thought I was wrong, so I was right. What event happened when I'm messing this up. The event that triggered Jesus' Galilean ministry is when John the Baptist was beheaded. And that's shown here on the chart as well. I messed up. So John is arrested. Oh, no. Can we go back 2 minutes? All right, so John is arrested, and Jesus begins his Galilean ministry. That's important for us to know. So it's kind of with some melancholy. Jesus begins his Galilean ministry that was so important, 2 years out of 3.5 years, when his forerunner, was arrested. And we all know what happens to John the Baptist eventually. He never gets out of prison, does he? He is beheaded while in prison. So question number 7, what triggered Jesus' early Galilean ministry? What event happened just as Jesus was beginning his Galilean ministry? John was arrested. Okay. Question number 8. What 2 feasts did Jesus attend during his later Judean ministry? Here's the answer. The first one is the Feast of Tabernacles, also known as the Feast of Booths. There's another name for it too. And that's going to be important for our study next week. The Feast of Tabernacles in John 7 and 8. The Feast of Dedication in John 9 and 10. The Feast of Dedication has another name, and what is that? Hanukkah. All right, as we're looking at this chronologically, the Feast of Tabernacles occurs in October of our calendar. The Feast of Dedication occurs in December of our calendar. You have friends who honor, what's the word I'm trying to think of? They celebrate. They celebrate Hanukkah. When do they do it? Right around the end of the year. That's going to help us chronologically to pinpoint when the events of John 7 and 8 happened and when the events of John 9 and 10 happened. October of AD 29 and then December of AD 29. What's going to happen the following April in AD 30? The crucifixion. So when we get into our study of Jesus' ministry, that's going to help us chronologically. Yes, ma'am. That's correct. The Feast of Dedication rose up in the time of the Maccabean revolt. And yet John's gospel doesn't treat it like anything else except a feast. So we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. The period of time that volume 2 covers is very little. It's about, 7 months. What is the focus of the 4 Gospels? I mean, they're all pretty long documents, but they are lopsided in their presentation. What is the time period that they focus on? You got this 3.5-year ministry of Jesus, but they hone in on 1 week. What's often referred to as the Passion Week, Passion being Jesus' suffering. And so Jesus made his triumphal entry on a Sunday. He is crucified at the end of the week on Friday, I believe. And we'll talk about that in a few months too. This is the time period covered in volume 2. Look at all we have covered. In 6 months, we covered the ministry of John, the opening events that included Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman in John 3 and John 4, turning water to wine. The Galilean ministry includes events like the Sermon on the Mount. We've covered all of that. On this chart, I also want you to note that there are 5 years represented. I didn't highlight AD 26 here, but you got AD 27, AD 28, AD 29, and then AD 30 through April. AD 30 through April. A lot of scholars believe it was actually AD 33, but I believe it was probably AD 30. Does it really matter? There's a reason why it's either AD 30 or AD 33. I would say, based on what the scholars have determined, that Jesus' ministry began in the summer of AD 26. This is part of the opening events. He had no disciples at that time. Eventually, he's going to have Philip and Nathaniel and Andrew and Peter. And we know that from John's account. So this is when Jesus began his ministry. Now let's talk about the Passovers. If you look on this chart, there is a disbursement of the Gospels. Can you see that there? It's underneath the main sections. Those are the disbursements. That's purple, and that's John. This green one is Matthew. The red one is Mark. The light blue is Luke, and then John. And take a look at the Galilean ministry here. What colors do you see? Ministry. You see Matthew, or Mark has a gap, doesn't he? Isn't that interesting? You see a lot of Luke. Who do you not see during the Galilean ministry represented? Isn't that interesting? John. And what he does mention is 4 Passovers in AD 27, AD 28, AD 29, AD 30. Again, we're not studying one gospel. We're looking at all 4 together, and I feel like this is necessary. I feel like this is going to help us know the big picture of Jesus' ministry, and that's why we're taking a class session to talk about this. So very, very little in the Gospel of John about the Galilean ministry. But then look at the opening events and the early Judean ministry of Jesus. The other 3 Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, don't talk about this at all. They don't talk about Jesus turning water to wine in John 2, Nicodemus in John 3, the Samaritan woman in John 4, the events of John 5 as well. And eventually we catch up in John 6 with the feeding of the 5,000. All 4 Gospels record that event. What we have are 4 Passovers in the Gospel of John, and that lets us know the ministry of Jesus wasn't just 2 years, a Galilean ministry, and boom, he's done. No, he had the opening events, and then he had a time where he went to Judea the first time. Why do we call the early Judean ministry, that 3-month period, why do we call that, or how many months? Yeah, 6 months, 8 months, can't read it. The early Judean ministry, when Jesus was with Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman, why do we call it the early Judean ministry? because there's going to be a later Judean ministry near the end of Jesus' overall ministry. These are terms that are used by scholars, yeah. And so I'm pretty traditional in that regard. All right, here are the 4 Passovers in John. John 2, verse 13. The Passover of the Jews was at hand. Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So if Jesus was in Galilee and he went down to Jerusalem, why does it say up? Geography, yeah, that's how they talked. Most of the time in the New Testament, when somebody's going up, they're heading toward Jerusalem. It was built on a hill, on Mount Zion, as it's called often. John 5 is debated. This may not be the Passover. Notice what it says. John 5 says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. We'll talk about that in just a second. And then you see the other 2 here that are definitely Passover. So without a shadow of a doubt, AD 27, John 2, AD 29, John, I'm messing up here. Yeah, 29, John 6, and then AD 30, John 11. What does that let you know? Between John 6 and John 11, there's a whole year. So that helps. If it's not in John 5, if it's not the Passover, then it's probably the Feast of Tabernacles, and that moves everything up to October. The reason why I think John doesn't identify the feast as the Passover is because in John's gospel, what he does in his presentation, we're just talking about John here for a moment, starting in John 5, what he does is superior to the various feasts or observances of the Old Covenant. And the first one he talks about is the Sabbath. So in John 5, what Jesus focuses on is what the Gospel of John shows us is that Jesus is superior to the Sabbath. He heals on the Sabbath. And that's a big, big deal in John 5 as well as in John 9. And I think to de-emphasize the connection with the Passover, John just says a feast. But it probably was the Passover. I know that sounds weak because it is. And a lot of people say, no, it was the Feast of Tabernacles. But in John 6, what does Jesus contrast himself with? The Passover. Do you remember in John 6 when Jesus fed the 5,000 and then he preached the I am the bread of life discourse? What is it that they talked about? Eating bread in the wilderness, eating bread for the Passover. And Jesus says, basically he says, I am that bread that you ate in the wilderness. I am the bread that comes down from heaven. And so the contrast in John 5 is between Jesus and the Sabbath. In John 6, it's Jesus and the Passover, the bread that comes down from heaven. And then finally in John 11, you're coming up to the point when Jesus is going to die on the cross. That kind of helps us in our understanding of John's gospel. John 5 through 12 contrasts Jesus with the Sabbath, with the Passover, with the Feast of Dedication. And so that's something we'll be looking at as we go through our study here. John's Passovers let us know Jesus' ministry wasn't just 2 years. It was 4 years. All right. The Galilean ministry is so important, and we've already studied it. We're done with it. What are some of the events that occurred during the Galilean ministry? Some of the highlights are on the chart. At the beginning of the middle Galilean, that's when Jesus chose his apostles. You would think he might have chosen them at the opening events, but no, it wasn't. It was not until the middle of the Galilean ministry. What about the Sermon on the Mount? Where is it? It's in the middle of the Galilean ministry. Can you see that? Jesus stilling the stormy sea, the feeding of the 5,000. So a lot of events, important events that we love and cherish, happened during the great Galilean ministry, especially the middle Galilean. At the very end of the Galilean ministry, the later Galilean ministry, as Jesus is closing that down, that's when the transfiguration takes place. So let's review from last year. The ministry of John. What happens during the ministry of John? What? John ministers. What's his preaching like? Hey guys, I love you so much. You're wonderful. You've been a great audience. Fire and brimstone. Let me tell you about this Messiah. I baptize you with water, but he's going to baptize you with fire. His winnowing fork is in his hand, and he's going to thresh his wheat and burn you all up. You brood of vipers, you Pharisees. Urgh. That's the ministry of John. And he baptizes Jesus as part of these opening events. And after Jesus' baptism by John, immediately the Spirit leads him into the wilderness where he is tempted by the devil. There's that big confrontation. You would be reading the synoptic gospels and think, okay, Jesus then immediately begins his Galilean ministry. But you would be wrong, because John says, no, hold on a minute. Jesus spent 8 months in Judea. And what happened in that period of time? The early Judean ministry, John 2, John 3, John 4. What events happened? The turning of the water to wine, John 2, John 3, Nicodemus, John 4, the Samaritan woman. So Jesus goes down to Judea, and then he goes back up to Galilee. And John lets us know it wasn't just immediately that Jesus started his Galilean ministry. In the early Galilean ministry, that's when he just starts preaching. People start realizing, hey, there's this authoritative voice out here. Jesus starts healing on the Sabbath and really getting some enemies. The religious leaders did not like Jesus from the beginning. During the Middle Galilean, one of the most significant events is the Sermon on the Mount. When he stormed the Sea of Galilee, that's just one of many events. What happened at the end of the later Galilean ministry as Jesus is winding down his great 2-year Galilean ministry? What was a major event that didn't even happen in Galilee? It happened in Caesarea Philippi when Jesus took his apostles away, and he went on top of a mountain and he was transfigured. And he asked his apostles this question: who do men say that I am? I've been in Galilee for 2 years. Who do men say that I am? Some say you are John the Baptist, raised from the dead, because John had already died during the Middle Galilean period, right as Jesus fed the 5,000. Some say you're Elijah. Why? Because Malachi said Elijah's coming. He's going to be the voice in the wilderness. Jesus wasn't Elijah, though. Who was Elijah? John the Baptist. Okay, we know that. Some say you're Jeremiah, and I think it's because Jesus was so critical of the temple and the temple leaders, just like Jeremiah had been in Jeremiah 7, his scathing temple sermon. That's where we come to the end of the Galilean ministry, and then Jesus is going to begin in Judea. So this is the period covered in the Galilean ministry that we spent a lot of time on. Notice again, John hardly talks about the Galilean ministry at all because he has a different agenda. We don't know if Matthew knew about Mark in his gospel, or that Luke knew about Matthew and Mark. There's a lot of speculation, a lot of theories. I think these guys all knew each other. I mean, wouldn't that make sense? They're all early disciples of Jesus after all. I think they would all know each other. I do believe John wrote his gospel after Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The reason I believe that, I don't know that to be true, is because there are so many important events recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that John doesn't cover. Where does John talk about the institution of the Lord's Supper? He never does. There's a lot of key events. John has a different agenda. And it would be a very useful study to look at Matthew all by itself, Mark all by itself, Luke all by itself, John all by itself. But we are surveying the Gospels together. So there's John's obligatory mention in the great Galilean ministry in John 5 and then John 6. Not much between John 5 and John 6. But we're trying to look at all of this. All right, what we will be looking at for the next 6 months is this teeny tiny little section that involves the later Judean ministry. That's where we're going to start next week. The Perean ministry, where Jesus goes to neighboring, here's Judea, he's going to go over to Perea, which is that Jewish territory? Jewish territory would be Galilee in the north, you got Samaria in the middle, that's not really Jewish territory, Judea in the south, and that's it. Perea is Gentile territory. Why does Jesus spend 3 months in Perea? Let me tell you, John the Baptist had gone to Perea, and they loved John. Jesus goes to Perea, and they loved him. They loved hanging out with Jesus. But the folks in Judea, they didn't. And so Jesus is going to go back there, and that's when he is going to die. I want to close our quick survey of our little chart, and I hope it helped, by reading a few verses from the opening of Mark's gospel. So here's verses 35 through 39. This is Jesus just beginning his Galilean ministry. And rising very early in the morning, he had spent all day previous healing and teaching. Busy, busy, busy. Rising very early in the morning, when it was still dark, Jesus departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. Spent all day preaching and teaching, and yet he gets up early to pray and commune with the Father. And Simon, that's Peter, right? And Simon and those who were with him searched for him, and they found him and said to him, "Everyone is looking for you." And he said to them, "Let us go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also. For that is why I came out." And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. So these verses let us know this is Jesus' purpose. The purpose of his ministry was to preach and to battle against the devil. That's what he came to do. And the ultimate death knell for the devil is what? How did Jesus ultimately defeat death and sin? By his crucifixion and resurrection. Crucifixion doesn't help us unless he's raised from the dead. That's exactly right. But look at this. This is why I came out. Some translations will just say, this is why I came. But this is a little interesting word. He came out. What does Jesus mean? This is why I came out. Came out of heaven. He came into this world for the very purpose of dying on the cross. Why are we studying the ministry of Jesus? A lot of denominational teaching is simply on the birth of Jesus. We celebrate the birth of Jesus. When do we do that? December. We celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. Yay, he rose from the dead. When do we celebrate that in Christendom? Easter, April, May. And that's it. But Jesus taught. He battled with the devil. He changed people's lives. And he can change our lives today because that's what he came to do. When Jesus was teaching in Galilee, he was also instructing some other people to continue his work after he left. And that's what the book of Acts is all about. There were trade routes all throughout Capernaum, and Jesus was smart. When he picked Galilee and Capernaum as his main base, which we've already looked at, word traveled all throughout the known world about this miracle worker from Galilee, claiming to be the Son of God. So after Jesus died, the world was ready when the apostles come on the scene and say, he's been raised from the dead. We are studying the four Gospels because we want to see what Jesus taught. We want to see what he did and how he changed the world. And next week, we're going to actually be getting into the Gospels, starting on pages 2 through 6 of Volume 2. If you're following the section numbers, those are sections 96 through 99. I've got a page out in the foyer with some questions, and it'll always identify what the class session is going to be. I would encourage you to get a copy of the book, but you don't have to get a copy of it. You have this book. and this is really the only book you need. Thank you for going through the chart with me, and I look forward to studying about our Lord and Savior and Him dying on the cross for us these next 6 months. Thank you.